The life of a void medic was measured not in years or achievements, but in the rhythmic, dying pulse of the station's environmental scrubbers. On Void 9, the air always tasted of recycled copper and old sweat, a stale bouquet that Kaelen Vane had long since stopped noticing. He sat at his cluttered desk, a piece of ancient equipment that had survived 3 separate civil wars, staring at a half-empty glass of amber liquid that claimed to be whiskey but was likely industrial coolant with a hint of cinnamon. Kaelen was 42 years old, though the bags under his eyes suggested a century of sleepless nights. His hands, scarred from a decade of cutting into soldiers on the front lines of the Solari expansion, were steady as he cleaned a microscalpel. He was a man of ghosts living in a tomb of iron in G-Set, serving a clientele of miners, smugglers, and the occasional runaway who didn't want their identity checked at the official ports. The gravity on Void 9 had a stutter. Every 50 seconds, the artificial pull would dip by 5%. It was a mechanical hiccup that everyone on the station lived by. Kaelen waited for the dip before he reached for his glass. He watched the liquid shiver, rising slightly toward the rim as the gravity failed, then settle back down as the stabilizers kicked in with a metallic groan. "Copy that," Kaelen muttered to the empty room. Another day in paradise. The doors to his clinic, which were more like repurposed cargo shutters, hissed open with a jagged screech. A Tellarite miner named Brack stumbled in, clutching a hand wrapped in a filthy, grease-stained rag. The Tellarite was a mass of muscle and gray scales, breathing heavily through his neck gills. "Doc, I did it again," Brack wheezed, collapsing onto the examination stool. Kaelen didn't even look up. "The hydro drill kicked back?" Brack grunted, his gills fluttering. "I swear that piece of junk is possessed. It hates me, Kaelen. It wants my fingers for breakfast." "Machines don't hate you, Brack," Kaelen said, standing up and crossing the room with a practiced limp. "They just have terrible operators who think they can out-torque a hydraulic piston. Let's see the damage." He peeled back the rag. The flesh was torn, angry and red, coated in thick lubricant oil. Kaelen reached for a canister of antiseptic foam and a dermal knitter. His hands moved with a cold, detached efficiency. He had seen thousands of these wounds. On the frontier, people were expendable, and the machines were even more so. Brake filled the silence with the usual sector gossip. The man loved to talk, mostly to distract himself from the sting of the chemicals. "Did you hear the chatter on the long-range comms, Doc? They say a shadow ship was spotted near the Erebos gate. No transponder, no lights. Just a black dagger in the dark. Some of the boys think it is the Ethelguard, the siphons." Kaelen rolled his eyes, adjusting the setting on the knitter. "There are no siphons in this sector, Brack. They are a ghost story used to keep children from playing near airlocks. The only things drinking energy in this void are corrupt Alliance officials and the occasional malfunctioning reactor." Brack hissed as the laser sutures fired, sealing the jagged cut. "I am telling you, Doc, my grandmother used to say the Ethelguard Queen could pull the starlight right out of a sun. They say she walks through the void without a suit, and her blood is made of liquid gold. And I say you need to keep this wound dry for 24 hours, Kaelen said, slapping a synth skin patch over the now sealed cut. "Or the only thing you will be seeing is a gangrenous stump. Now bug out. I have a date with a bottle that doesn't talk back." He sent the miner on his way, giving him a small, sugar-free candy from a jar on the counter. It was a habit he couldn't shake from his days in the infantry. As the doors closed, Kaelen leaned back against the cold wall, exhaling a long, weary breath. Ghosts and monsters. The galaxy was terrifying enough with just warlords and bureaucratic decay. It didn't need vampires to make it worse. Suddenly, the station's proximity alarm screamed. It wasn't the rhythmic ping of a docking request. It was the harsh, dissonant shriek of a collision warning. The sound vibrated through Kaelen's teeth, making his vision blur. He slammed his glass down, splashing liquid onto a stack of data pads, and grabbed his trauma kit. On an outpost this small, an emergency meant everyone with a pulse and a functional pair of hands was on duty. He ran through the corridors, his magnetic boots clanking on the metal grating. The gravity stutter hit him mid-stride, making him weightless for a split second before he slammed back down, stumbling but keeping his momentum. He reached the hangar bay just as the airlock cycled. The rescue crew was already there, a sorry sight of three miners who smelled of distilled engine coolant and a pair of loading drones that were sparking from their joints. "What do we have?" Kaelen shouted over the roar of the atmospheric cyclers. "Something hit the belt," the hangar chief yelled back, pointing toward the magnetic field. A stealth ship, small, fast. It clipped an asteroid and spun out. "We are dragging it in now." The tractor beams groaned, straining against a mass that seemed far too heavy for a vessel of its size. Slowly, a ship materialized through the containment field. It was sleek, shaped like an obsidian dagger, its hull composed of a material that seemed to absorb the hangar lights rather than reflect them. It crashed onto the deck with a deafening screech of tearing metal, sliding 50 meters before coming to a halt. "Get the jaws!" Kaelen ordered, rushing forward. The drones pried at the cockpit canopy. The metal screamed, resisting with a strength Kaelen had never seen in standard alloy. Finally, it shattered. White smoke poured out, acrid and smelling of ozone, and something sweeter, like rotting flowers. Kaelen vaulted onto the wing, peering through the smoke. There was only one pilot. She was slumped over the controls, held in place by a harness that looked more like a web of organic fibers than a safety restraint. Kaelen cut the straps with his laser scalpel. As the body came free, he gasped. She was wearing armor plates of shifting, organic chitin that seemed to be trying to knit themselves back together over deep gashes. But it was the woman herself who stopped his heart. She was tall, impossibly pale, with hair like spilled ink floating in the residual static of the crash. And she was bleeding, but the blood was not red. It was a shimmering, viscous substance that refracted the hangar lights, splitting the white beams into spectrums of violet and gold. "She is not breathing," one of the miners shouted. "Move!" Kaelen barked, hauling her out of the cockpit. His boots slipped in the strange, glowing blood. She was heavy, dense as a neutron star despite her slender frame. He threw her over his shoulder, ignoring the protest of his aging spine, and ran for his clinic. He didn't know who she was or what she was, but in his world, a heartbeat was a mandate. He wasn't just a man, he was a medic, and he had work to do. The clinic was freezing. Kaelen had cranked the environmental controls down to 30%, hoping to slow whatever internal hemorrhaging was occurring inside the stranger's body. He had stripped off the ruined organic armor, which had peeled away from her skin with a wet, sucking sound that made his stomach turn. Now she lay on his surgical table, pale as polished marble. Her body was a map of lacerations and burns, but it was her anatomy that defied his 20 years of experience. Kaelen worked in a trance, his hands usually steady but now trembling slightly as he reached for the nanostitches. "I am just a man treating wounds," he murmured to himself, the sound of his own voice a fragile anchor in the quiet room. Just treating wounds, nothing more. He repeated the mantra as he clamped an artery near her ribs that pulsed with that impossible starlight blood. The scanner he used, a top-of-the-line military model he'd stolen during his desertion, kept throwing up error messages. Unknown species, genetic architecture invalid. Her heart rate was 10 beats per minute. Her body temperature was 10 degrees Celsius. By every human standard, she should have been KIA 5 minutes after the crash. Yet the wounds on her arms were already beginning to close, the gold liquid crystallizing into a temporary seal. Kaelen reached for a bottle of high-grade saline, but before he could clear the site, the room began to change. It wasn't a power failure. The shadows in the corners of the clinic began to elongate, stretching toward the surgical table like hungry fingers. The air grew frigid, his breath misting in front of his face in thick, white clouds. "Just fatigue," Kaelen whispered, blinking his eyes. "Just the stress of the void." The woman on the table stirred, her head thrashed to the side and her lips, stained with gold, parted. "Vespera," she whispered. Her voice was a rasp, layered with a harmonic resonance that vibrated in Kaelen's teeth. Ethel, soulless. That was High Ethel Guardian. Nobody spoke that tongue anymore, not since the Great Culling 2 centuries ago. Kaelen had heard recordings in medical school, examples of the languages of the lost sectors, but hearing it live was like hearing a ghost scream. Brack, the miner who had lingered by the door to help with supplies, dropped a tray of instruments. The metal clattered loudly on the floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Did you hear that?" Brake whispered, backing away, his face draining of color. Those are the old words, Doc. The scourge. That is no pilot. It is just delirium, Brack, Kaelen said sharply, though his own heart was hammering against his ribs. She is in shock. Her brain is misfiring. No, Brack stammered, his eyes wide with primal terror. My grandmother told the stories. The gold blood. The shadow reach. That is a siphon, Kaelen. That is a demon from the Erebos. We have to vent the room. We have to dump her into the void before she wakes up. Get out, Kaelen said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. But Doc, I said get out. Go drink yourself into a stupor and forget you saw anything. If you breathe a word of this to the station administrator, I will tell everyone you have been skimming the mineral crates. Brake fled, the cargo shutters hissing shut behind him. Kaelen looked back down at the woman. Her eyes snapped open. They were not human. There was no white, no iris. They were solid, burning crimson, generating their own light like twin embers in a dark forest. For a second, Kaelen felt like prey. He felt a primal instinct to run, to hide, to curl into a ball and pray for a quick end. Then the woman groaned, the red fading to a pained, dull maroon, and the terrifying presence collapsed back into the shape of a wounded person. Where am I? She asked, her voice weak but carrying an undeniable weight of command. Void 9 Station, Kaelen said, forcing his hands to resume their work. You crashed. You were bleeding out. She tried to sit up, but Kaelen put a hand on her shoulder. It felt like touching a block of ice, a cold that seeped into his bones. Stay down, he ordered. You have lost a lot of blood, or whatever this fluid is. She looked at him then, truly looked at him. Kaelen felt stripped bare by the intensity of her gaze, as if she were reading his DNA, his memories, and his sins all at once. I am Rin, she said. The lie was smooth, practiced, but there was a flicker of hesitation behind her eyes. I am a mercenary. I was targeted by pirates in the nebula. Kaelen snorted softly, applying a final bandage to her arm. Pirates. Right. Because pirates usually fly stealth ships that cost more than this entire sector and shoot down mercenaries wearing bioarmor from the Third Era. She stiffened, her gaze sharpening. You know armor types. I was a medic in the Solari infantry for 12 years, Kaelen said. I know a lot of things I wish I didn't. Look, lady, I don't care who you are. I don't care if you stole that ship or if you are running from the law. In this room, you are a patient. That is it. She stared at him, stunned. She seemed braced for interrogation, for torture, or perhaps for worship. She clearly didn't know what to do with clumsy honesty. I need to leave, she said abruptly, swinging her legs off the table. You will die if you stand up, Kaelen said flatly. I cannot stay here if they find me, she snapped, her eyes darting to the door. Anyone who saw me, the crew who pulled me out, they are liabilities. Kaelen froze. He slowly put down the laser scalpel, his eyes narrowing. What did you say? They saw the ship, she said, her voice turning cold and pragmatic. They saw me. If my pursuers track me here, they will torture everyone to find my trajectory. It is cleaner to silence them now. Kaelen stepped between her and the door. He crossed his arms over his chest, his stained medical coat a stark contrast to her otherworldly beauty. Nobody is silencing anyone, he said. Those men saved your life. They are already dead, she hissed, a flash of something ancient and terrible entering her voice. You do not understand what is hunting me. I don't care, Kaelen said. He pointed a finger at her, a gesture so pitifully human against her aura of power that it was almost absurd. You touch one hair on their heads and I will lock this clinic down. These doors are rated for orbital bombardment. You will be stuck in here with me until the oxygen runs out. She stared at him, her crimson eyes widening. You would die to protect strangers? I would die to stop a murder in my clinic, Kaelen corrected. It is bad for business. She looked at him, confused, frustrated, and for the first time uncertain. She had expected fear. She had expected greed. She had not expected a stubborn, tired man blocking her path with nothing but a bad attitude and a sense of ethics. Before she could respond, the station shuddered. It wasn't the gravity glitch. This was a heavy impact. A siren began to wail, different from the collision alarm. This was the intrusion alert. "They are here," she whispered, the gold blood on her skin beginning to glow. Kaelen checked the monitor on the wall. External cameras showed a ship docking, a sleek Predator-class frigate. It bore no name, but on its hull, painted in matte gray, were two symbols side by side, the golden sun of the Solari Union and a stylized, jagged drop of blood. "Solari?" Kaelen frowned. "And what is that?" "The Shadow Council," she said, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. "They are working together." The clinic's comm unit crackled to life. It was the station administrator, his voice trembling with terror. "Kaelen! Kaelen! We have guests. They are asking for a crash survivor. They are heavily armed. Kaelen, they just shot Brack." The blood drained from Kaelen's face. "Brack?" He tried to run. "They just cut him down." Rin flinched. It was a small, involuntary motion, a twitch of the eye, but Kaelen saw it. She looked down at her hands, her expression twisting with a sudden, sharp guilt. "They are here for me," she said softly. "Okay," Kaelen said. His voice was shaking, but he was already moving, grabbing a stimulant injector and a portable med scanner. "Okay, Plan B." "What is Plan B?" "We lie," Kaelen said. "We lie our asses off." He threw her a spare medical gown, a drab, shapeless thing made of green synthetic fiber. "Put this on. Cover the markings on your skin." "Why are you helping me?" she asked, freezing halfway into the motion. "I threatened to kill your friends." "And now the people chasing you actually killed one of them," Kaelen said grimly. "That makes you the lesser of two evils. Put the damn gown on." The clinic doors hissed open before she was fully settled. 3 figures stepped in. They were nightmares of chrome and black leather. 2 were human operatives with dead eyes and pulse rifles. The third was tall, painfully thin, wearing a high-collared coat and dark glasses. He moved with a liquid grace that made Kaelen's skin crawl. "Dr. Vane," the tall one said, his voice like oil sliding over velvet. "We are looking for a fugitive, a crash survivor." Kaelen stood in front of the surgical table, blocking their view of the woman as best he could. He wiped his bloody hands on a rag, trying to look bored. "I have a lot of patience, buddy. You are going to have to be more specific, and you owe me for the door mechanism you just forced." The tall man stepped closer. He lowered his glasses. His eyes were pale yellow, the pupils like vertical slits. "Where is the pilot?" Kaelen gestured carelessly behind him. "You mean the burn victim? Picked her up an hour ago. Shuttle malfunction." He stepped aside. The woman lay on the table, the green gown pulled up to her chin. She looked small, frail, her eyes closed. The tall man leaned over her. He sniffed the air, his nose wrinkling. "She smells wrong," the man said. "Infection," Kaelen lied smoothly. "Gamma rot. Highly contagious. That is why the room is so cold. I am trying to freeze the bacteria. You get close enough to smell it, you are probably already breathing the spores." The 2 human operatives took a hasty step back. The tall creature hesitated. He leaned in closer to her face. Kaelen saw the woman's hand tighten on the fabric of the gown, her muscles coiling. She was preparing to strike. If she moved, if she revealed her strength, the room would turn into a slaughterhouse. The tall man reached out a gloved hand to touch her cheek. Kaelen stepped forward, jamming the tip of his medical scanner between the man's hand and the woman's face. "Do not," Kaelen snapped, "unless you want your skin to slough off in sheets within the hour. I don't have enough quarantine beds for you 3. The tall man paused. He looked at the scanner, which Kaelen had rigged to display a terrifyingly high biohazard reading. He looked at Kaelen's tired, annoyed face. Then he sneered, pulling his hand back. "Filth," the creature muttered. He turned to the operatives. "Search the rest of the station. If the target is not here, she is hiding in the tunnels. Burn it all if you have to." They turned and marched out. The tall man lingered for 1 second more, his yellow eyes boring into Kaelen, before spinning on his heel and following them. For 10 seconds, neither of them moved. Then the woman let out a breath that sounded like a sob. Her legs gave out, and she slid off the table. Kaelen caught her. It was an instinctive reaction, the reflex of a medic. But the moment his arms went around her, the dynamic shifted. She was heavy against him, burning with a fever heat now instead of the cold. Her head fell onto his shoulder. Her armor had dissolved into her skin, leaving her in just the thin gown, and he could feel every tremor in her body. She froze. Her face was pressed into the junction of his neck and shoulder. She could hear the thrum of his carotid artery. The sound was deafening to her enhanced senses. Thump, thump, thump. The smell of him, sweat, coffee, antiseptic, and the rich iron tang of living blood filled her nose. The hunger hit her like a physical blow. Her fangs ached to descend. It would be so easy. He was soft. He was right there. One bite, and she would have the strength to kill the assassins, the strength to heal, the strength to rule. Kaelen did not pull away. He did not cringe. Instead, he shifted his grip to support her better. He leaned his head forward until his forehead rested against hers. "Breathe," he whispered. "Just breathe. They are gone." The contact shocked her. It was not a grapple. It was not a prelude to violence. It was a gesture of profound, baffling intimacy. He was not afraid. Or rather, he was terrified. She could smell the cortisol spiking in his sweat. But he was choosing to hold her anyway. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling with the effort of not tearing his throat out. "I could kill you." "You won't," Kaelen said, his voice steady. "You are not a monster, Rin. You are just a patient, and I have never lost a patient yet." The lie was kind. They both knew it was a lie. He had lost plenty of patience, and she was definitely a monster. But the kindness of it shattered her resolve. She sagged against him, the predatory tension draining away, leaving only exhaustion. "We have to go," Kaelen said, pulling back gently. He kept his hands on her arms, stabilizing her. "Go?" she asked, blinking. "They will figure it out," Kaelen said. "That guy, the tall one." He wasn't convinced. He is going to check the logs. He is going to realize gamma rot doesn't exist in this sector. They will be back in 10 minutes, and they will bring heavier weapons. "You must leave me," she said, finding her footing. "Run. Take an escape pod." Kaelen shook his head. He began tearing off his bloodied lab coat, revealing a faded flight suit underneath. "Not happening. My ship is in Hangar 3. It's a piece of junk. The hyperdrive leaks, and it smells like wet dog. But it's fast enough." "Kaelen," she started, using his name for the first time. "Do not argue with your doctor," Kaelen said, grabbing a duffel bag and throwing in med packs and ration bars. "Come on. This is officially the worst house call of my entire life." She looked at his hand. It was scarred, calloused, and open. She took it. They ran. The hangar bay of Void 9 was a symphony of chaos and grinding metal. Kaelen Vane ran with a desperation he hadn't felt since the siege of Athelgard, his lungs burning with the sharp, recycled air of the station. Behind him, Rin moved with a grace that seemed to defy the very laws of gravity he lived by. Even wounded, she was faster than a human, her feet barely touching the grease-slicked floor as they dodged between massive crates of unrefined ore and sparking loading drones. "There!" Kaelen shouted, pointing toward a docking berth at the far end of the bay. The Star Suture was not a beautiful ship. It was a boxy, scarred medevac shuttle that had been decommissioned after the Solari Wars and rebuilt by Kaelen's own scarred hands. It looked like a brick that had been chewed on by a giant and then spit out into the vacuum. But to Kaelen, it was the only home he had left. It was a vessel of mercy in a galaxy that had forgotten the meaning of the word. They reached the ramp just as the station's internal speakers boomed with the cold, synthesized voice of the Shadow Council's commander. "All sectors are now under lockdown. Any individual aiding the fugitive will be executed on sight. This is your final warning." "Copy that," Kaelen muttered, punching the entry code into the Star Suture's keypad. His fingers were slippery with Rin's golden blood, and it took him 3 tries to get the sequence right. The ramp hissed down, and they scrambled inside. Rin collapsed onto the deck plates the moment the interior sensors registered her presence. The green medical gown was soaked through with shimmering violet and gold. Her skin was turning translucent, the veins beneath appearing like dark, frozen rivers. "Inside the cockpit," Kaelen barked, grabbing her by the arm and hauling her toward the pilot's seat. He didn't wait for her to sit. He practically threw her into the co-pilot's chair and strapped her in with the heavy magnetic harness. He vaulted into the pilot's seat, his hands flying over the toggles and switches. The star suture groaned as its old reactor began to thrum. It was a low, guttural vibration that Kaelen felt in his marrow. He engaged the thrusters and the ship lurched forward, breaking its docking clamps with a violent snap that sent a shiver through the hull. "Kaelen!" A voice crackled over the short-range comms. It was the station administrator, his voice now high and thin with terror. "They are at the hangar doors. They have a pulse cannon. Hold on to your soul, Rin," Kaelen gritted out. He slammed the throttle forward. The star's suture screamed as its main engines ignited, a blue plume of plasma scorching the hangar deck. They shot out of the bay just as a massive bolt of crimson energy tore through the space where they had been hovering a heartbeat before. The impact sent the ship spinning into the darkness of the void, the debris of the asteroid belt flashing past the viewport like jagged teeth. Kaelen fought the controls, his muscles straining against the manual yoke. He didn't use the computer for navigation. In the belt, the sensors were useless, and he relied on the raw, instinctive twitch of his hands. He wove the ship between two massive rocks, the proximity alarm screaming a dissonant chorus of 3 different tones. Once they cleared the inner belt, Kaelen punched the sequence for a micro-jump. It was a dangerous maneuver, a blind leap into the slipstream without a calculated exit. But it was the only way to shake the Shadow Council's pursuit. The stars outside the viewport stretched into long, white lines of infinite light, and the ship lurched into the void, leaving Void 9 and its ghost behind. Silence descended on the cockpit. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the hum of the air recycler and the distant rhythmic ticking of a cooling engine. Kaelen slumped back in his seat, his heart rate slowly returning to double digits. He rubbed his face, feeling the grit of the hangar floor and the dried gold of Rin's blood on his skin. He turned his head to look at her. She was unconscious again, her head lolling against the headrest. The crimson fire in her eyes had gone dark, replaced by a hollow, sunken look that made his stomach turn. He unbuckled his harness and stood up, moving toward her with his trauma kit. "We need to talk about your biology, Rin," he whispered, though she couldn't hear him, "because none of this makes any damn sense." He moved her to the small, cramped medical bay in the rear of the shuttle. The star suture was built for triage, and the surgical table was the most advanced piece of equipment on board. He laid her out, her pale skin stark against the sterile white of the padding. He took a sample of the shimmering fluid still leaking from the wound on her ribs. He placed it into the ship's centrifuge and started the analysis. While the machine whirred, he reached for a high-power microscope, a relic from the old world that relied on optics rather than digital interpretation. What he saw through the lens made him recoil. It wasn't blood, at least not as any human doctor would define it. The gold fluid was a teeming colony of nanoscopic structures, each one shaped like a perfect, translucent octahedron. They weren't just floating in the plasma, they were the plasma. They moved with a collective intelligence, shifting and reconfiguring themselves in response to the light of the microscope. They weren't cells, they were machines. Bioenergy processors capable of self-replication and energy harvesting. Kaelen's breath hitched. He looked at the readings from the scanner. Her DNA was a triple helix woven through with a crystalline lattice that acted as a conductor for these nanites. This wasn't just a species, this was a masterpiece of biological engineering. A shadow moved across the table. Kaelen looked up to find Rin's eyes open. They weren't burning anymore. They were a deep, sorrowful violet, the color of a dying star. "You see it now," she said. Her voice was stronger, though it still carried that strange, multi-layered resonance. "You see what I am." "A miracle?" Kaelen asked, his voice hushed. "Or a nightmare?" "A weapon," Rin said, sitting up with a slow, deliberate movement. "My people, the Ethelgard, did not evolve. We were crafted. Long before your ancestors learned to build fire, we were the keepers of the Erebos. We were designed to be the ultimate conduits of life energy." Kaelen sat on a stool, his hands resting on his knees. The stories say you drink blood, that you are vampires. Rin let out a dry, rattling laugh. Blood is just a medium, Kaelen. It is a dense source of biophotons. We do not drink for pleasure. We drink to maintain the internal lattice. Without energy, the nanites in our systems begin to consume our own tissues. We starve from the inside out, our bodies becoming the fuel for our own immortality. She looked at the golden fluid on the slide. I am a siphon. That is what your kind called us during the wars. But we called ourselves the emissaries. We were meant to be the balancers of the galaxy. Kaelen stood up and began to clean her wounds again, his touch gentle but firm. And now? What are you now? A fugitive, she said. A queen without a throne. A monster in a green gown. Kaelen didn't answer. He applied a fresh layer of antiseptic foam to the gash on her ribs. He watched as the nanites in her system immediately began to interface with the chemical, drawing it into the wound and using it as raw material to rebuild the flesh. It was a process that should have taken weeks. She was doing it in minutes. You know, Rin, Kaelen said, his voice quiet, in the infantry, we were taught to hate your kind. We were told you were the darkness that would swallow the light of the Solari. I saw the aftermath of your vanguard's attacks. I saw the empty husks of soldiers left behind. Rin looked away, her jaw tightening. The wars were a tragedy of misunderstanding. My houses were divided. Some wanted to lead. Some wanted to harvest. I tried to unify them. I tried to impose an order that would prevent the slaughter. And how did that work out for you? Kaelen asked. She looked at the walls of the small ship, her gaze distant. I was betrayed by my own generals and by the humans they had made deals with. The Shadow Council is not just a human organization, Kaelen. It is a cabal of those who believe that only the strong deserve to breathe. They want my genetic code not because they fear me, but because they want to replicate me. They want to create a galaxy of masters and thralls. Kaelen stopped what he was doing. He looked her in the eye, ignoring the primal fear that still whispered in the back of his mind. Why didn't you kill me back at the clinic? You were strong enough. You could have taken my life and used the energy to heal yourself instantly. Rin reached out, her fingers brushing the scarred skin of his forearm. The touch was cold, but there was a strange, vibrating warmth beneath it. Because you didn't look at me like a monster, Kaelen. You looked at me like a patient. For 300 years, I have been feared, worshipped, or hunted, but I have never been treated. She leaned back, her eyes closing. You chose to save me when it would have been easier to let me die. You gave me a choice I didn't think I had. Kaelen exhaled, a long, weary sound. Well, don't get used to the 5-star service. The coffee is terrible, and the pilot is an old man with a bad back. He stood up and began to pack away his instruments. We are heading for the Tenebrous sector. It is a neutral zone, mostly pirates and independent traders. We can lay low there for a while, figure out our next move. Kaelen, Rin said. He turned at the door of the medbay. Yeah? Why are you really doing this? You are a human. You have a life. You could have stayed on Void 9 and lived in peace. Kaelen looked at his hands, the hands that had seen too much death and not enough life. Peace is a lie, Rin. I was just waiting to die in a different kind of silence. Besides, I told you, I have never lost a patient, and I am too old to start now. He walked out, leaving her in the quiet glow of the medical lights. As he reached the cockpit, he looked out at the infinite field of stars. He had spent his life running from the wars of others, trying to hide in the rust and the shadows. But as he looked at the sensor screen, he saw a faint, red blip on the edge of the range. The Shadow Council was still coming, and this time, he wasn't just a doctor. He was an accomplice to a revolution. Copy that, he whispered to the empty air. Time to move. The star suture was deep in the Tenebrous sector, a region of space where the stars were old and the nebulae were thick with the ionized dust of long-dead planets. It was a place where sensors went to die, which made it the perfect graveyard for a ship that didn't want to be found. Kaelen sat in the pilot's chair, his eyes fixed on the long-range scanner. The red blip had disappeared 3 hours ago, but he knew better than to trust the silence. The Shadow Council's hunters were like bloodhounds. Once they had a scent, they would follow it to the edge of the universe. He felt a presence behind him. Rin had changed into a pair of his old flight fatigues, the gray fabric hanging loose on her slender frame. She had pulled her hair back into a tight knot, making her pale features look even more severe. "We are being shadowed," she said. "It wasn't a question." "I know," Kaelen replied, his hands resting on the yoke. "They are staying just outside the gravity well of the nebula, waiting for us to make a move. They are testing our resolve," Rin said, walking to the viewport. "They know the ship is old. They are waiting for a mechanical failure, a leak in the seals, a stutter in the reactor. They want us to break before they even fire a shot." Kaelen grunted. "Well, they are going to be waiting a long time. This ship is held together by spite and duct tape. It doesn't know how to quit." Rin turned to him, her violet eyes soft. "Spite is a powerful fuel, Kaelen. I have lived on it for centuries. But even spite has its limits." Suddenly, the ship lurched. A massive, concussive force slammed into the starboard hull, throwing Kaelen against the console. The lights in the cockpit flickered and died, replaced by the harsh, strobing red of the emergency power. "Hull breach in Sector 4? The ship's computer shrieked. Pressure dropping. Automated seals engaged. "They found us!" Kaelen yelled, grabbing the controls. They didn't wait. They used a long-range kinetic penetrator. He punched the thrusters, but the ship groaned and refused to accelerate. The reactor was struggling to compensate for the sudden loss of atmospheric pressure. On the sensor screen, 3 sleek white silhouettes emerged from the purple clouds of the nebula. They were interceptors, the elite hunting hounds of the Solari Union, modified with Ethel Guardian stealth tech. "Kaelen," Rin said, her voice dropping to that dangerous, resonant hum. "Do you have weapons?" "A point defense laser and a couple of mining charges," Kaelen said, his fingers flying over the weapons console. "It's like bringing a knife to a supernova fight." "Then let me be the weapon," Rin said. She stepped toward the airlock. "Are you crazy?" Kaelen shouted, looking back at her. "You are still wounded. You can't survive out there without a suit." "I told you, Kaelen, I don't need a suit. I am the void." She didn't wait for his permission. She stepped into the airlock and hit the manual cycle. Kaelen watched on the internal monitor as the inner door closed and the outer door began to open. "Rin!" he screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the depressurizing chamber. On the external camera, he saw her step out into the vacuum. She didn't explode. She didn't freeze. Instead, her skin began to glow with a brilliant, pearlescent light. The golden nanites in her system were reacting to the raw radiation of space, creating a shimmering field of energy around her body. She wasn't floating, she was moving. She launched herself toward the nearest interceptor like a bolt of violet lightning. The interceptor tried to bank away, its pilot clearly terrified by the sight of a woman flying through space without a vessel. But Rin was faster. She landed on the hull of the fighter, her claws extending from her fingertips and slicing through the reinforced alloy as if it were parchment. She didn't use a bomb. She didn't use a gun. She reached into the ship's internal wiring and began to siphon. Kaelen watched in stunned silence as the interceptor's lights dimmed. The engines sputtered and died, the energy being drawn directly into Rin's body. She was drinking the ship. She was consuming the very power that kept it in the air. With a final, violent surge, the interceptor exploded in a silent bloom of blue fire. Rin was thrown back by the blast, her body tumbling through the dark. "One down!" Kaelen cheered, his voice cracking. But 2 to go. The other 2 interceptors were closing in on the star suture, their pulse cannons charging. Kaelen knew he couldn't wait for Rin to recover. He had to act. He reached for the mining charges. They were designed to blow through solid rock in deep space, and they were the most volatile things on the ship. He set the timers for 10 seconds and ejected them through the waste disposal chute. He banked the star suture hard to the left, putting the charges between him and the pursuers. The interceptors, focused on the wounded woman in the void, didn't see the small gray cylinders floating in their path. The explosions were massive, a chain reaction that turned the space between the ships into a wall of fire and jagged shrapnel. One of the fighters caught the brunt of the blast, its cockpit shattered by a piece of flying ore. The second fighter was clipped, its wing torn off, sending it into a slow, terminal spin. Kaelen didn't waste a second. He brought the star suture around, navigating the debris field to find Rin. He spotted her a kilometer away. Her glow faded to a dim, pained flicker. He used the tractor beam, usually reserved for hauling in cargo crates, to catch her. He pulled her toward the airlock, his heart hammering in his chest. "Is she okay? Is she alive?" he whispered, his hands shaking on the controls. The airlock cycled, and the inner door hissed open. Rin fell into the chamber, her body covered in a fine layer of frost. Her clothes were shredded, and her skin was marked by the jagged lines of cosmic radiation. Kaelen rushed to her side, wrapping her in a thermal blanket. He checked her pulse. It was erratic, a frantic drumming that felt like it was trying to break through her skin. "I got you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I got you." She opened her eyes, her breath coming in shallow, icy gasps. I told you. I am the weapon." "You are an idiot," Kaelen said, though there was no heat in his voice. "You could have been vaporized." "Redemption is not cheap," she whispered. He carried her back to the medical bay, his mind racing. They had survived the immediate threat, but the encounter had proven one thing. The Shadow Council wasn't just hunting a fugitive. They were hunting a source of infinite power, and they wouldn't stop until they had it. He sat by her side as the ship's automated systems began to repair the hull breach. The Star Suture was wounded, its systems flickering, but it was still moving. "Rin," Kaelen said, his voice grave. "They aren't going to let this go. Those interceptors, they weren't just Solari pilots. I saw the markings on the wreckage. They were House Valerius, your own kind." Rin's eyes darkened. "Valerius, my consort. He was always a man who preferred a golden cage to a free throne. He must have made a deal with the council. He gives them my blood, and they give him the sector." "It's not just about power, is it?" Kaelen asked. "No," Rin said, sitting up with a grimace of pain. "It is about Project Absolution." The name sent a chill down Kaelen's spine. "I've heard rumors of that in the underground. A way to end all wars." "It is not an end to war, Kaelen. It is the end of the unwanted. They plan to use my nanites to create a targeted plague, a virus that can be programmed to recognize specific genetic markers. They will release it into the atmosphere of the frontier worlds." Kaelen felt a sick sensation in his gut. They will kill anyone who isn't pure. Anyone who is poor, anyone who is rebellious, anyone who is human but doesn't fit their vision of a perfect society. And they will blame it on a biological mutation. They will call it a natural disaster. "And you are the only one who can stop it," Kaelen realized. "I am the only one who can provide the antidote," she said. "My blood is the only thing that can rewrite the nanite code once it has been released." Kaelen looked at his hands. He thought of the miners on Void 9. He thought of the families he had seen in the refugee camps on Orestes Prime. They were the ones who would die, the ones who didn't have the credits or the pedigree to be pure. He stood up and walked to the cockpit. He looked at the star chart, his eyes settling on a point of light in the distance. "Where are we going?" Rin asked, appearing in the doorway. "To the summit," Kaelen said. "The Shadow Council is meeting at the Vega station in 3 days to sign the Unification Treaty. That is when they will launch the plague." Rin looked at him, her violet eyes wide with surprise. "That is the most heavily defended point in the galaxy. We won't make it past the first moon." "Probably not," Kaelen said, a crooked grin forming on his face. "But I'm a doctor, Rin. I'm used to delivering bad news." He engaged the hyperdrive, the Star Suture jumping into the long, white lines of the slipstream once more. "Why are you doing this, Kaelen?" Rin asked softly. "You don't owe these people anything. They are the ones who turned you into a ghost." Kaelen looked at her, and for the first time the weariness in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, clear light. "Because I spent 12 years taking orders that broke my soul, Rin. I spent 12 years being a part of the machine that made these monsters." He leaned forward, his voice steady. "I didn't save you because you are a queen. I saved you because you were a person in pain. And if I don't help you stop this, then every life I've saved in this clinic was just a stay of execution." He reached out and took her hand. His human fingers were warm against her cold starlight skin. "Family isn't just about the blood we share, Rin. It's about the choices we make when the universe tries to tear us apart." Rin looked at their joined hands. She felt the warmth of his pulse, a steady, rhythmic promise in the dark. For the first time in 300 years, the Siphon Queen felt something other than hunger. She felt a choice. Then we go to Vega, she said, and we show them what happens when you try to hunt the void. The star suture vanished into the darkness, a small, scarred ship carrying the weight of 1 billion lives. It was a vessel of mercy, heading straight into the heart of the storm. Copy that, Kaelen whispered. 0 dark 30. Let's go. The interior of the star suture was a pressurized tomb of flickering amber and the rhythmic wheezing sound of a dying air recycler. They were deep in the tenebrous sector, 3 light-years from the nearest automated relay, and a lifetime away from the life Kaelen Vane had tried to build for himself on Void 9. The ship felt smaller than it had 2 hours ago, the walls closing in as the life support struggled to compensate for the jagged holes Rin's departure and return had punched in the hull. Kaelen sat on the floor of the medical bay, his back against a rack of sterile gauze. He was exhausted, his muscles trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline. He watched Rin. She was draped in a thermal blanket, her skin a translucent gray that looked like frost on a windowpane. The shimmering gold of her blood had faded to a dull, sluggish brown. She was starving. "I can hear it," she whispered, her voice a thin thread of sound. "The lattice. It is breaking down. The nanites are looking for fuel, Kaelen. They are starting to unmake the marrow." Kaelen reached for his trauma kit, his fingers fumbling with the latch. He was a doctor who had spent 20 years patching up bullet holes and cauterizing shrapnel wounds. But he didn't have a protocol for a starving goddess. He pulled out a bag of synthetic glucose and a high-calorie protein suspension. "Drink this," he ordered, his voice cracking. Rin didn't move. Her crimson eyes were dim, the embers nearly extinguished. "It is not enough," she said. "Synthetic energy is like trying to fuel a starship with a candle. I need biophotons. I need a living conductor." Kaelen knew what she meant. He had seen the reports from the Unity Wars. The siphons didn't just eat, they merged. They took the raw electrical and chemical energy of a living nervous system and used it to jumpstart their own stalled reactors. "You mean you need me?" Kaelen said. Rin looked at him, a flicker of her old pride returning to her eyes. "I would rather fade into the void than turn you into a husk, Kaelen. You are a medic. You are soft. If I take from you while I am this weak, I might not be able to stop. I could drain you in 3 minutes. Then we better make sure those 3 minutes count," Kaelen replied. He stood up, his knees popping with a sound like dry twigs. He didn't think about the risk. He didn't think about the fact that he was offering himself to a predator who could turn his brain to ash with a single touch. He thought about the 5 miners he had seen executed on Void 9 because he had been too slow to act. He thought about the millions of people in the frontier who would never have a choice if Project Absolution launched. He rolled up the sleeve of his flight suit, exposing his forearm. The blue veins were prominent, pulsing with the steady, stubborn rhythm of a human heart. "No," Rin whispered, turning her head away. "Rin, look at me," Kaelen said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding tone he hadn't used since he was a chief medic in the Solari infantry. "You told me you wanted to be a person, not a weapon. Well, people make sacrifices for their own. You saved this ship. You saved me. Now it is my turn to fix the damage." He knelt beside her, pulling her close. She was cold, so cold that he felt the heat leaving his own body the moment they touched. He placed his bare arm against her lips. "On my terms, Rin," he said. "You take what you need to stabilize. No more. If I tell you to bug out, you bug out. Copy that?" Rin's eyes flared for a second, a spark of hunger meeting a spark of terror. She reached out, her fingers tangling in the fabric of his shirt, her grip surprisingly weak. She didn't bite him. The Ethel Guardian fangs were for defense, not for feeding. Instead, she pressed her forehead against the inside of his wrist. The contact was a physical blow. Kaelen gasped as a jolt of pure, white-hot energy was ripped from his nervous system. It felt like his veins were being filled with liquid lead. His vision blurred, the edges of the room spinning into a vortex of red and black. He could feel her. It wasn't just a physical sensation. It was a psychic breach. For a moment, his mind was flooded with her memories. He felt the crushing weight of 1,000 years of history. He saw the birth of the Ethelgard, the moment their ancestors were modified by a forgotten precursor race to be the Wardens of the Stars. He felt the cold, majestic loneliness of a queen who had to be a statue because her people needed something to worship. He also felt her fear. She was terrified of him. She was terrified of the warmth he represented, the messy, fragile, beautiful humanity that she had been taught to view as cattle. "Kaelen!" A voice screamed in the back of his mind. He realized he was slipping. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but the beat was getting faint, a distant drum in a thickening fog. He was flatlining. The nanites in Rin's system were gorging themselves on his life force, weaving his biophotons into her broken lattice. "Stop," he tried to say, but his tongue was heavy, a piece of lead in his mouth. Rin's eyes snapped open. She saw the gray pallor of his skin, the way his pupils were dilating into nothingness. She felt the stutter in his heart, the same stutter as the Void 9 gravity generators. With a guttural cry of effort, she shoved him away. Kaelen slumped against the bulkhead, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He couldn't feel his hands. He couldn't feel his feet. He was cold, a hollow shell of a man, his internal battery drained to 5%. Rin was no longer gray. She was radiant. Her skin glowed with a soft, gold light, and her eyes were burning with a fierce violet intensity. The wounds on her ribs were gone, the flesh knitted together as if they had never existed. "What have I done?" she whispered, looking at her hands. Her voice was rich, resonant, and full of a devastating guilt. Kaelen managed a weak, lopsided grin. You stayed alive," he wheezed. "That was the mission, remember?" He tried to sit up and failed, his muscles refusing to obey. Rin was beside him in a blur of motion, her hands catching him before he hit the deck. Her touch was no longer cold. She was burning with the energy she had taken from him. She pulled him into her lap, cradling his head against her chest. "I took too much," she sobbed, a silver tear tracing a line down her cheek. "I am a monster, Kaelen. I am exactly what they said I was." "No," Kaelen said, his voice a whisper. "A monster wouldn't be crying. A monster would be looking for the next juice box." He reached up, his fingers trembling as he brushed the tear away. It was a simple human gesture, but in the silence of the medbay, it felt like a declaration of war against the entire galaxy. "You didn't take it, Rin," Kaelen said. "I gave it. There is a difference." Rin held him tighter, her head resting against his. For the first time in her long life, she didn't feel like a queen. She felt like a daughter. She felt like a sister. She felt like someone who had found a home in the last place she ever expected to look. "We have to move," Kaelen whispered, his eyes drifting shut. "The Shadow Council. They'll be tracking the energy spike from that feeding." "I will hide us," Rin said, her voice turning sharp and determined. "I will take us to the Onyx 3 moon. It is a scrap heap full of interference. They won't find us there." She picked him up as if he weighed nothing, carrying him to the pilot's seat. She sat him down and buckled the harness, her movements gentle and precise. "Rest, Kaelen," she said, her lips brushing his forehead. "The medic is off duty. I am the pilot now." Kaelen didn't argue. He let the darkness take him, a small smile playing on his lips. He had bet his life on the idea that family was a choice, and for once in his life, he felt like he had won. The star suture banked hard, diving into the purple mists of the Tenebris sector, a ghost ship carrying a queen and her doctor into the heart of the night. Onyx 3 was a moon that had been forgotten by God and abandoned by the Solari Union 50 years ago. It was a jagged, airless rock orbiting a gas giant that bled radiation like a punctured artery. The surface was a graveyard of old mining equipment and the rusted husks of colony ships that had never quite made it to the terraforming stage. Rin brought the star suture down in a deep, shadowed crater, the landing struts groaning as they settled into the fine gray dust. She had spent the last 6 hours at the controls, her mind focused on the subtle art of ghosting, masking their heat signature and scrambling their ion trail using the moon's own magnetic interference. She checked the medical monitors. Kaelen was still unconscious, but his vitals were stabilizing. His heart rate was a steady 60 beats per minute, and the gray tint had left his skin. He was sleeping the deep, restorative sleep of a man who had pushed himself past the point of no return. She stepped out of the ship, her boots sinking into the dust. She didn't need a breathing apparatus. Her internal nanites were processing the trace gases in her own lungs, recycling the carbon into oxygen with a efficiency that made human technology look like a child's toy. The crater wasn't empty. A dozen figures emerged from the shadows of a collapsed ore processor. They were Ethel Guardians, but they weren't like the high-born lords Rin had grown up with. Their skin was dull, their eyes lacked the crimson fire of the elite, and their clothes were a patchwork of stolen Solari uniforms and scavenged industrial mesh. The bloodless, Rin whispered. They were the low tier of her race, those whose genetic lattice had failed to manifest the full siphon potential. In the old empire, they were the laborers, the servants, the ones who were given just enough energy to stay alive and work the mines. The leader of the group, a man with a scarred face and a prosthetic arm made of rusted iron, stepped forward. He held a kinetic rifle leveled at Rin's chest. "State your house," the man rasped. His voice was dry, the harmonic resonance broken and buzzing like a blown speaker. "I have no house," Rin said, standing her ground. "I am a traveler seeking refuge." The man's eyes narrowed. "You carry the scent of the high throne. You smell of starlight and arrogance, but you also smell of human." The others moved closer, their movements jerky and desperate. They looked at the star suture with a hunger that Rin recognized all too well. It was the hunger of the dying. "Where is the host?" one of the women hissed. "I can hear the heartbeat inside the metal. It sounds fresh. It sounds rich." "He is under my protection," Rin said, her voice dropping to a low, vibrating growl. "If any of you touch that ship, I will turn your marrow to ash." The leader laughed, a harsh, rattling sound. "Protection? You are one of them, aren't you? One of the queens who left us to rot when the Solari came. You sat in your glass towers while we were hunted like vermin." "I am not the queen you remember," Rin said. "Then you are just more meat for the grinder," the man said, raising his rifle. "Give us the human, and maybe we will let you live long enough to watch us feed." Rin felt the darkness rising inside her. The energy she had taken from Kaelen was pulsing in her veins, a warm, golden tide of power. She could kill them all in 10 seconds. She could wipe this crater clean and be back on the ship before the dust even settled. But then she remembered Kaelen's face. She remembered the way he had looked at Brack the miner. She remembered the way he had treated the wounds of his enemies without hesitation. "If I kill them, I am the monster he saved me from," she thought. She lowered her hands, her palms open. "I will not give you the human," she said, "but I can give you hope." The bloodless paused. "Hope?" the leader sneered. "We don't eat hope, lady. We eat biophotons, and we haven't had a fresh source in 3 months. We are eating the batteries out of the mining bots just to keep our hearts from stopping." Rin reached into the pocket of her flight suit and pulled out a small crystal vial. It was the concentrated essence of the Ethel Guardian royal blood, a substance that could jumpstart a failing lattice for a dozen people at once. She had been saving it for herself, a final reserve in case she was captured. "This is the blood of the sun," Rin said, holding the vial up. "It is enough to sustain your entire group for a year. It will heal your scars. It will clear your eyes." The bloodless gasped, their eyes fixed on the glowing amber liquid. "What is the catch?" the leader asked, his rifle wavering. "The catch is that you tell me what you have seen," Rin said. "I am looking for the Shadow Council. I know they have a facility in this sector." The leader looked at the vial, then at Rin. He lowered his rifle. "They are at the Iron Reach," he said, 200 kilometers from here. It is an old Union research station. They have been bringing in shuttles of refugees every night. We hear the screaming through the comm links." Rin felt a cold knot of dread form in her stomach. "They are testing the virus," she whispered. "They are doing more than testing," the man said. "They are refining it. They call it the Great Cleansing. They say that once the summit is over, the stars will belong to the pure." Rin tossed the vial to him. The man caught it with his one good hand, his eyes wide with wonder. "Go," Rin said. "Feed your people, and then get as far away from this moon as you can." "Why are you doing this?" the man asked, clutching the vial to his chest. "You could have destroyed us." "Because a friend of mine told me that family is a choice," Rin said, her voice steady. and I am choosing to believe that we are more than the hunger that defines us." She turned and walked back toward the star suture, her heart heavy. She had found the location of Project Absolution, but she knew that she couldn't take on an entire research station alone, and she couldn't risk Kaelen's life again. As she entered the ship, she found Kaelen sitting up in the medbay, his face pale but his eyes sharp and alert. "You were gone a long time," he said. "I was making a deal," Rin replied, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I found them, Kaelen. The Iron Reach. It is where they are building the plague." Kaelen nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then we have a deadline. 200 kilometers. We can be there in 20 minutes if we push the engines." Rin looked at him, her eyes filled with a sudden, sharp pain. "Kaelen, you can't go. You are too weak. Your system hasn't recovered from the feeding. If you get into a fight, you will flatline for real this time." Kaelen grabbed his trauma kit and stood up, his movements slow but deliberate. "I spent 12 years following orders that I knew were wrong because I was afraid of the cost of standing up. I'm done being afraid, Rin. If those people at the Iron Reach are being turned into test subjects, then they are my patients. And like I said, I have never lost a patient." He looked at her, and for a moment, the doctor and the queen were equal. Two souls lost in the dark, trying to find a way to become something better than the history that had forged them. "Copy that," Rin said, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. "Then let's go save the world." As the star suture lifted off from the gray dust of Onyx 3, the Shadow Council's hunters were already closing in. The game of hide-and-seek was over. It was time for the war to begin. The cost of their choice was high, and the risks were astronomical. But as the ship shot toward the Iron Reach, Kaelen Vane finally felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He was a man with a scalpel, a queen with a heart of starlight, and a universe that was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the galaxy is a little bit of mercy. The Iron Reach did not look like a laboratory. As the star suture drifted through the thick, violet soup of the Onyx 3 upper atmosphere, the structure emerged from the swirling mist like a jagged obsidian tooth. It was a massive vertical spire of reinforced duralium and dark glass, anchored into the side of a frozen mountain that had been hollowed out to house the heavy cooling units required for large-scale genetic sequencing. There were no lights on the exterior, no welcoming beacons for lost travelers. It was a monument to secrecy, a silent predator waiting in the dark. Kaelen Vane sat in the pilot's seat, his hands steady on the yoke, but his mind a storm of ancient ghosts. The radiation from the moon's core was playing havoc with the sensors, sending cascades of false positives across the holographic display. Every time the screen flickered, he saw the face of a soldier he had failed, or a patient he had lost during the Siege of Orestes. "This place is Fubar, Rin," Kaelen muttered, his voice a low rasp in the quiet cockpit. "It smells like a butcher shop with a fresh coat of paint. Even from 3 kilometers out, I can feel the weight of what they are doing down there." Rin stood behind him, her hand resting on the back of his chair. The golden glow from the feeding had settled into a steady, translucent shimmer beneath her skin, but her eyes remained dark, scanning the spire with a predator's focus. "The resonance is jagged," she said, her voice vibrating with a harmonic frequency that made the nearby glass hum. "It is the sound of life being edited. It is a desecration." Kaelen checked the tactical overlay. According to the data the Bloodless had given them, the primary entry point was a ventilation shaft located 500 meters below the main docking bay. It was a narrow, dangerous approach that required ghosting the ship through a series of thermal vents that could melt the hull in 10 seconds if the timing was off. "Copy that," Kaelen said, his fingers dancing over the thruster controls. "We are going in low and slow. I am going to drop the dampeners to 10% and ride the thermal waves. If we get spotted, we are sitting ducks." "I will mask us," Rin said. She closed her eyes and a wave of shadow began to bleed from her fingertips, wrapping around the star suture like a living shroud. It wasn't just visual camouflage. It was a biophotonic dampener that absorbed the ship's heat signature, turning the vessel into a literal ghost in the machine. They descended into the mountain shadow. The star suture groaned as the atmospheric pressure increased, the old hull plating screaming in protest. Kaelen ignored the warnings, his eyes fixed on the narrow opening of the vent. He waited for the stutter, not of the gravity, but of the thermal cycle. 3, 2, 1. Now! He punched the thrusters. The ship shot forward, the heat from the vent washing over the viewport in a blinding orange glare. For 5 seconds, the interior temperature of the cockpit spiked to 40 degrees Celsius. Kaelen's skin beaded with sweat, and the smell of ozone filled the cabin. Then, they were through, sliding into the darkness of the maintenance tunnel. The star's suture settled into a recessed alcove with a heavy metallic thunk. Kaelen let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "We are in," he whispered. "But the clock is ticking. Project Absolution launches in less than 24 hours. He grabbed his trauma kit and a scavenged pulse carbine, checking the charge pack. Rin was already at the airlock, her organic armor shifting and knitting itself into a more aggressive, bladed form. She looked less like a person and more like a statue of vengeance carved from the void itself. "Wait," Kaelen said, catching her arm. "Rin, if we find people in there, test subjects, we save them first. That is the deal." Rin looked at him, her violet eyes reflecting the red emergency lights of the airlock. "If we stop to save every thrall, we may fail to stop the plague, Kaelen. Billions are at stake, and if we let a dozen people die because it is more efficient to ignore them, then we are no better than the Council," Kaelen shot back, his voice firm. "I didn't save you because it was the efficient choice. I saved you because you were a life in front of me. That has to mean something." Rin stared at him for a long moment. The cold, logical part of her mind, the part that had ruled an empire for 3 centuries, screamed that he was wrong. But the part of her that had tasted his memories, the part that had felt the warmth of his blood, knew he was right. "I understand," she said softly. "The choices define the family. Let us move." They slipped into the corridors of the Iron Reach. The interior was a stark contrast to the rusted chaos of Void 9. The floors were polished white polymer, the walls were lined with glowing data conduits, and the air was chilled to exactly 15 degrees Celsius. It was a temple of cold logic, a place where the messy reality of biological life was being stripped down into code and commerce. They moved like shadows through the lower levels, bypassing security patrols with Rin's sensory dampening. Kaelen used his old military codes to hack the localized terminals, mapping out the route to the central processing core. As they neared level 4, the smell changed. It wasn't just ozone anymore. It was the sharp, metallic tang of blood and the sweet, sickly scent of chemical stabilizers. Kaelen stopped at a reinforced observation window. His stomach dropped. Below them, in a massive, vaulted chamber, were hundreds of stasis pods. Inside were refugees, humans, Tellarites, and even Ethelgardian commoners. They weren't just being held, they were being harvested. Thin, translucent tubes ran from their spines into a central manifold where a swirling cloud of purple nanites was being fed their biophotons. "Those are the test subjects," Kaelen whispered, his hand tightening on the grip of his carbine. "They are using them as live batteries to calibrate the virus." Rin walked up to the glass, her fingers trembling as she touched the surface. "They are siphoning them to death. Slowly, so the nanites can learn the exact frequency of their fear." She let out a low, vibrating growl that shattered a nearby display screen. "I knew Malachor was a snake, but this is a desecration of the great gift. We have to shut it down," Kaelen said. "If we break the manifold, the nanites will lose their power source. It will buy the colonies time. And it will kill everyone in those pods," a voice boomed from the shadows at the far end of the hallway. Kaelen spun around, his carbine raised. Out of the darkness stepped a man in a pristine white Solara uniform, his chest adorned with a dozen medals of honor. He was older, his hair a shock of silver, his eyes a cold, piercing blue. "Commander Harkin," Kaelen breathed, his voice full of a decade's worth of bitterness. "Vane," Harkin said, his voice as calm as a winter morning. "I heard rumors you were still alive, hiding in the rust of the frontier. I should have known you would show up here. You always had a talent for finding the moral high ground in the middle of a slaughter." Kaelen didn't lower his weapon. "You ordered the bombardment of arrestees, Harkin. You killed 4,000 civilians to protect a data cache that turned out to be useless. Why are you working for the vampires now? Did the Union run out of children for you to kill? Harkin took a step forward, seemingly unbothered by the rifle pointed at his heart. The Union is a dying beast, Vane. It is bloated, inefficient, and obsessed with the rights of people who contribute nothing to the collective strength of the species. The Ethelguard understand the truth. Evolution requires a cull. If we want to survive the next millennium, we must remove the impurities from the gene pool. Impurities, Kaelen hissed. You are talking about refugees. You are talking about the very people you swore to protect. I am protecting the future, Harkin said. Project Absolution is the ultimate medicine. It will cure the galaxy of the weak, the sick, and the rebellious. It will create a unified, genetically superior humanity, shielded by Ethelguardian technology. It is the only way to end the wars forever. It is a massacre with a fancy name, Harkin, Kaelen said, and I am here to pull the plug. Harkin smiled, a thin, joyless expression. You haven't changed, still trying to save the world one patient at a time. But look at your friend, Vane. He gestured toward Rin. You think she is different from us? She is the ultimate predator. She has spent 300 years drinking the lives of others to maintain her beauty. Do you really think she cares about those meat bags in the pods? Rin stepped forward, her crimson eyes burning with a light that made Harkin flinch. I care about the choice, Commander. I spent centuries thinking I was above the cattle. But a human medic showed me that a queen is nothing without the people she serves. She raised her hand, and the shadows in the hallway began to swirl into a violent vortex. And I am through serving your counsel. Harkin didn't flinch. He reached for a control panel on his wrist. Then you will die with the impurities. He punched a command, and the floor beneath Kaelen and Rin shifted. A series of heavy magnetic shutters slammed down, separating them from the hallway. At the same time, the stasis pods in the chamber below began to hiss, the nanite manifold glowing with a lethal, purple intensity. The purge has begun, Harkin's voice echoed over the intercom. In 5 minutes, the test subjects will be liquefied to provide the final surge for the launch. Try to save them if you can, Doctor. But remember, every second you spend on them is a second the galaxy loses. Kaelen looked at Rin, his heart hammering against his ribs. We have to get down there. The stairs are blocked, Rin said, her bladed fingers digging into the reinforced duralium of the shutter. She looked at the floor, her eyes narrowing. We go through the deck. She let out a roar of raw, telekinetic force. The floor plating beneath them groaned, the metal shearing away as she ripped a hole through 2 levels of reinforced flooring. They plummeted into the processing chamber, landing in a spray of sparks and coolant fluid. Kaelen scrambled to his feet, running toward the central manifold. The nanites were a swirling cloud of purple death, hovering just inches above the manifold's core. He saw a young Tellarite girl in the pod nearest to him, her eyes wide and glassy, her life force being drained in visible golden threads. I need the override, Kaelen shouted, his fingers flying over the pod's control panel. Rin, keep the security droids off me. He didn't have to look to know she was moving. The shadows of the room became her weapons, lashing out at the automated turrets that descended from the ceiling. Rin was a whirlwind of violence, her movements so fast she was a blur of black and violet light. But Kaelen was focused on the girl. He saw the readings on the pod. Her heart rate was 40, 35. She was flatlining. Come on, Kaelen gritted out, punching a series of emergency codes. Copy that, you piece of junk. Let her go. The pod hissed and the glass slid back. Kaelen caught the girl as she slumped forward, her skin cold and clammy. He checked her pulse. Thready, but there. He reached for a stimulant injector, but as he did, a massive shadow fell over him. A heavy assault droid, 3 meters tall and armed with twin rotary cannons, stepped out from behind a cooling pillar. It leveled its weapons at Kaelen and the girl. Target identified, the droid's synthesized voice boomed. Execution authorized. Kaelen didn't have his rifle. He didn't have a shield. He just had his body and the child in his arms. He squeezed his eyes shut, braced for the impact of the pulse fire. The sound of the cannons was a deafening roar, but Kaelen didn't feel any pain. He opened his eyes to see Rin standing in front of him. She wasn't using shadows. She was using her own body. She had taken the full force of the rotary cannons, the pulse rounds chewing into her organic armor, sending sprays of gold blood across the floor. She stood like a titan, her teeth bared in a snarl of pure defiance. "Rin!" Kaelen screamed. "Save them!" She wheezed, her voice a grating harmonic. "I have the droid." She lunged forward, grabbing the droid's cannons and ripping them from their mounts with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for someone so wounded. She drove her bladed hand through the machine's central processor, the droid exploding in a shower of blue sparks. Rin collapsed to her knees, her armor smoking, her skin a network of jagged burns. Kaelen ran to her, still holding the Tellarite girl. "You idiot!" Kaelen cried, his voice breaking. "Why didn't you use the shadows?" "The shadows take time to manifest," Rin whispered, her eyes dulling. "You were out of time." She looked at the girl in Kaelen's arms. "Is she alive?" "Yes," Kaelen said, his tears mixing with the dust and blood on his face. "She's alive because of you." Rin let out a weak, rattling laugh. Then it was a good choice. But the manifold was still glowing. The countdown on the main screen was at 2 minutes. The plague was still launching, and Rin was too weak to stop it. Kaelen looked at the manifold, then at the hundreds of pods around them. He looked at the girl, and then at the woman who had just nearly died to save her. Transformation was no longer a theory, it was a requirement. He knew what he had to do, and he knew it would change him forever. "I'm sorry, Rin," he whispered, "but I'm taking over." The air in the processing chamber was thick with the scent of ozone and the high-frequency hum of the nanite manifold, a sound that felt like a needle being driven into the base of Kaelen's skull. The red emergency lights cast long, jagged shadows across the room, turning the rows of stasis pods into a graveyard of glass and steel. Kaelen laid the Tellarite girl gently on the floor, tucking her into a corner where she was shielded by a cooling pillar. He turned back to Rin. She was slumped against the base of the central manifold, her golden blood pooling on the white polymer floor. Her breathing was a wet, shallow rattle, and the violet fire in her eyes was fading to a dim, grayish ember. "Rin, stay with me," Kaelen said, his hands moving with the desperate speed of a battlefield triage. He pulled a heavy-duty medical scanner from his kit and ran it over her. The readings were FUBAR, multiple internal hemorrhages, cellular destabilization, and her biophotonic lattice was collapsing. "I am fading, Kaelen," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the machinery. "The hunger, it is returning, but there is nothing left to take." Kaelen looked at the manifold. He looked at the holographic display floating above the core. T-minus 90 seconds to deployment. The nanites were fully charged, a swirling cloud of purple death ready to be injected into the station's atmospheric relay, from which they would be transmitted across the sector to the colonies. "I can't hack the launch command," Kaelen realized, his fingers trembling as he tapped the console. "Harkin's encryptions are hardwired into the biological manifold. The only way to stop the launch is to disrupt the energy frequency. And the only thing that can do that is a high-born Ethel Guardian signal," Rin wheezed. "I can do it, if I have the strength. But I am empty, Kaelen. I am a dry well." She looked at the pods around them. Hundreds of lives, still being siphoned, still being used as fuel for the very plague that would destroy their homes. "There is enough energy in those pods," Rin said, her voice turning cold and pragmatic. "If I draw from them, if I take everything they have left, I will have the power to shatter the manifold and stop the launch." Kaelen froze. "You mean you would kill them? All of them?" "They are already dying, Kaelen," Rin snapped, her eyes flaring with a sudden, desperate crimson. "If I don't take their energy, the plague launches and billions die. It is a simple calculation. 100 lives for 10 billion. Isn't that what your military taught you? The greater good?" Kaelen looked at the pods. He saw a human woman, a Tellarite miner, a young Ethel Guardian boy with his hands pressed against the glass. They weren't numbers. They weren't a calculation. They were people who had woken up that morning with dreams, fears, and a right to the air they were breathing. No, Kaelen said, his voice flat and hard. That is not how we do this. Kaelen, there is no other way, Rin shouted, her voice breaking with the strain. I am not strong enough. I will fail, and then we all die. Then take it from me, Kaelen said. Rin went silent. She stared at him, her eyes wide with horror. No, I already took too much. Your heart barely restarted the last time. If I take from you now, while you are this stressed and wounded, you won't make it, Kaelen. You will flatline. Then I flatline, Kaelen said. He stepped toward her, kneeling in the pool of her blood. He grabbed her hand and pressed it against his chest, right over his hammering heart. I am a doctor, Rin, he whispered. I spent my whole life trying to keep people on this side of the void. But if I let you kill those people to save others, I'm not a doctor anymore. I'm just another Harkin. I'm just another monster deciding who is worthy of life. His voice was steady, despite the terror that was screaming in his mind. I love you, Rin, and I am choosing you. I am choosing them, and I am choosing the man I want to be. Rin looked at him, and for the first time in 300 years, she saw the true strength of humanity. It wasn't in their weapons or their empires. It was in their capacity to make a choice that defied every law of nature and survival. Kaelen, she breathed, her silver tears falling onto his hand. Copy that, Rin. Now do it, before I change my mind and decide to run away like a coward. Rin closed her eyes. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. She didn't want to do it. Every instinct in her body screamed that this was wrong, that she should protect him, that she should be the one to sacrifice. But she saw the clarity in his eyes, the absolute resolve of a soul that had finally found its purpose. She began to siphon. Kaelen's world exploded into a white-hot agony. It wasn't the dull ache of the first feeding. This was a total system override. He felt every nerve in his body catch fire. His muscles seized, his jaw locking tight as a silent scream tore through his mind. He saw his life flash by, not as a highlight reel of his failures, but as a series of faces. He saw his mother's smile in the light of a Solari sunset. He saw his first patient in the infantry, a 19-year-old boy who had died holding Kaelen's hand. He saw Brack, the miner, on Void 9. And then he saw Rin. He poured everything he was into the connection. His memories, his hopes, his stubborn, weary compassion. He gave her his courage, his ethics, and the raw, unyielding heat of his human spirit. Rin's body began to glow with a brilliant, blinding light. The golden nanites in her system were being supercharged by Kaelen's biophotons, transforming into something new, something pure. Her armor turned from black to a shimmering, iridescent silver. The shadows in the room didn't just retreat, they were annihilated by the radiance. Stop! Kaelen managed to wheeze, his voice sounding like it was coming from 1,000 miles away. Rin pulled away, her eyes now twin suns of white and violet fire. She looked down at Kaelen. He had collapsed onto his side, his skin the color of ash. His eyes rolled back in his head. His heart was a faint, irregular flutter, a dying moth trapped in a cage of ribs. I have you, Kaelen, she whispered, her voice a thunderclap of harmonic power. Stay with me. She turned to the manifold. The purple nanites were swirling in a frenzy, the countdown at 10 seconds. Rin didn't use her claws. She didn't use a blast of force. She reached out with her mind, projecting the collective image of the human spirit she had just tasted. She showed the nanites the memories Kaelen had given her. She showed them the value of the individual, the sanctity of life, the beauty of the flawed and the weak. She rewrote the code. The purple light vanished, replaced by a soft, healing amber. The nanites didn't launch into the atmosphere. They began to cycle back into the stasis pods. But they weren't killing anymore. They were repair units. They began to knit the damaged tissues of the test subjects, purging the toxins from their blood, restoring the energy they had lost. The manifold shivered and then went dark. The countdown stopped at 0. Rin didn't stop. She turned toward the station's main server bank. She sent a massive pulse of her new, supercharged energy into the grid. It wasn't a destructive pulse. It was a carrier wave. Across the sector, every Shadow Council terminal, every automated drone, and every military cruiser received the same signal. It was the confession of Admiral Harkin and the data on Project Absolution. But it was more than that. It was the genetic signature of the new Ethel Guardian Queen, a signature that demanded peace. Rin collapsed, her energy spent, the silver glow fading to a steady, warm light. She crawled toward Kaelen, her hands trembling as she reached for his neck. No pulse. Kaelen! She shrieked, the sound breaking the silence of the room. No! You don't get to leave me. You don't get to save everyone and then die. She grabbed a defibrillator from his trauma kit. She didn't know how to use it, but she had seen him do it a dozen times in her dreams. She placed the pads on his chest, her hands slick with her own blood. Charge to 300, she whispered, mimicking his voice. Clear. The machine hummed and then sent a jolt of electricity through Kaelen's body. He jerked, but his heart remained silent. Again, Rin yelled. Clear. Nothing. Rin looked at him, her heart breaking. She looked at the man who had seen a monster and called her a patient. She realized that she was a queen of a dead empire, but he was the king of a new world. She leaned down and pressed her lips to his. She didn't try to take energy this time. She tried to give it. She breathed her own starlight into his lungs, a desperate final gift of life. Kaelen gasped. His eyes snapped open, his chest heaving as he fought for air. He looked up at Rin, his vision blurry and dark. Did we win? He wheezed. Rin let out a sob of pure, unadulterated joy. We won, Kaelen. We stopped the launch. The refugees are waking up. Kaelen managed a weak, shaky smile. Copy that. I need a nap and a really big coffee. He drifted back into a natural sleep, his heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. Rin stayed by his side, her hand interlaced with his. She looked up at the observation window. Admiral Harkin was gone. The security droids were offline. The Iron Reach was silent, no longer a tomb but a sanctuary. She looked at Kaelen, and she realized that he was right. Family wasn't about the blood. It was about the choice to stay when the universe gave you every reason to run. She had been born a weapon, but she had chosen to be a shield. And as the dawn of a new day began to break over the horizon of Onyx 3, she knew that they had finally found the piece of the void that they could call home. The silence that followed the collapse of the nanite manifold was not the hollow, ringing void of an explosion, but a heavy, pressurized quiet that felt like being submerged in deep water. In the processing core of the Iron Reach, the air no longer carried the sharp, electric tang of ozone. Instead, it smelled of rain on hot pavement and something faintly floral, a ghost of the scent Rin had carried since the crash on Void 9. Kaelen Vane opened his eyes slowly. His vision was a blurred mosaic of drifting white particles, like a slow-motion snowstorm in a vacuum. His body felt as though it had been disassembled and put back together by an amateur mechanic. Every joint ached with a dull, throbbing heat, and his skin felt tight, a size too small for his frame. Copy that, he whispered, though the words were caught in his dry throat. Still on the right side of the dirt, he tried to sit up, but a hand, cool and firm, pressed against his shoulder. Stay down, Kaelen. Your heart has only been back in rhythm for 20 minutes. The feedback from the lattice nearly cooked your nervous system. He blinked and the mosaic resolved into Rin's face. She was different. The black, jagged plates of her war armor had been replaced by a soft, iridescent sheen that looked like liquid mercury under the emergency lights. Her eyes, once twin embers of predatory crimson, were now a deep, luminous violet, reflecting the hundreds of tiny, glowing amber specks that were still drifting through the air. The nanites, Kaelen managed to wheeze, gesturing weakly at the atmosphere. They are changed, Rin said. She looked around the chamber, and for the first time her expression wasn't one of imperial command or desperate survival. It was wonder. You were right, Kaelen. The code was malleable. When we merged, when I felt your stubbornness, the system didn't just reboot, it evolved. Kaelen managed to prop himself up on one elbow, his head spinning. He looked past her to the rows of stasis pods. The glass was no longer fogged with the purple mist of the plague. Instead, the pods were clear, and the people inside were moving. The Tellarite girl he had pulled from the manifold was sitting up in her corner, her large dark eyes wide as she watched a cluster of amber nanites hover over a scrape on her knee. The tiny machines weren't eating her flesh. They were knitting it together, leaving behind smooth gray scales where there had been raw, bloody wounds. Across the room, a Union medic, one of the men Harkin had left behind, was staring at his own hands. A chronic tremor, likely the result of years of exposure to reactor radiation, had vanished. He looked up, meeting Kaelen's gaze, and gave a slow, hesitant nod. It was the look of a man who had seen a ghost and realized the ghost was there to help him. Secondary characters, once just numbers in the Council's grand calculation, were becoming people again. Rin helped Kaelen to his feet. He leaned heavily on her, his legs feeling like they were made of damp cardboard. They began to walk through the facility, a strange limping parade of the saved and the transformed. The Iron Reach, once a tomb of cold logic, was now a sanctuary of messy organic life. As they neared the exit of the processing level, they found a figure slumped against a cooling pillar. It was Admiral Holloway. The stimulant Kaelen had injected earlier had worn off, and he was pale, his breathing coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The blood from his side had slowed, but his eyes were glassy, unfocused. Kaelen stopped. Rin's hand tightened on his arm. "We should move, Kaelen. The station is still unstable. We need to get to the star suture before the automated failsafes trigger a total lockdown." Kaelen looked at Holloway. The man had authorized the blockade. He had stood by while the Council planned to liquefy billions. Logic said to leave him. Logic said he was a waste of resources, a liability in a high-stakes escape. "I'm a doctor, Rin," Kaelen said, his voice stronger now, "and he's still breathing." He let go of her support and knelt beside the dying admiral. He pulled a fresh med pack from his kit, his fingers moving with that old, familiar rhythm. He didn't see an enemy. He didn't see a war criminal. He saw a localized hemorrhage and a shock-induced cardiac dip. Holloway looked up, his eyes clearing for a brief second as he recognized the medic. "Why?" he whispered, his voice a dry rattle. "We were going to kill you." Kaelen didn't look up from the wound. "Yeah, well, you missed. And I've got a really bad habit of not letting people die on my watch, even the ones I don't particularly like." He applied a pressure seal to the admiral's side and injected a coagulant. Rin stood over them, her silver armor reflecting the amber glow of the nanites. She watched Kaelen work, and Kaelen could feel the shift in her resonance. She wasn't just observing a medical procedure, she was witnessing the final piece of her own transformation. She reached down, not to strike, but to offer her hand to Holloway. The admiral flinched, but Rin's touch was gentle. A pulse of warm, violet energy flowed from her fingertips into his skin. Holloway's breathing eased. The gray pallor of his face was replaced by a faint, healthy flush. "He is stabilized," Rin said, her voice echoing with a new kind of power. "He will live to face the justice of the people he tried to destroy." "That is the human way, isn't it?" Kaelen looked up at her and grinned, a bloody, tired, beautiful expression. "Copy that, Rin. You are catching on." They gathered the survivors, nearly 200 refugees and a dozen low-level Union staff who had been abandoned by their superiors. They moved through the ventilation shafts and maintenance tunnels, avoiding the final, desperate patrols of the Shadow Council's elite guards. As they reached the star suture, Kaelen looked back at the Iron Reach. The spire was no longer a dark tooth in the mountain. It was glowing. The amber nanites had spread through the entire structure, dismantling the weapon systems, dissolving the toxic chemicals, and turning the laboratory into a beacon of light that pierced the violet mists of Onyx 3. The cost had been high. Kaelen felt a permanent hollowness in his chest, a reminder of the energy he had given to jumpstart the change. His hands would always have a slight tremor now, a souvenir of the day he played God and chose mercy. But as he watched the Tellarite girl climb into the star suture, holding the hand of a human nurse, he knew the price was a bargain. He wasn't just a medic anymore. He was a survivor of the old world, helping to build a new one out of the scrap and the rust. Inside the ship, the air still smelled of bad coffee and ozone, but it felt like home. Rin sat in the co-pilot seat, her hands resting on the console. She looked at Kaelen, and for a moment the silence between them was full of everything they had learned. They had learned that the void wasn't empty. It was full of choices. "We have 10 hours until the summit at Vega Station begins," Rin said. "The council will try to spin the story. They will say the Iron Reach was a terrorist attack. They will say the plague was my doing. Then we better make sure we have a louder voice," Kaelen said, his fingers finding the familiar toggles of the Star Suture's engines. "I've got the data logs from the manifold. I've got the testimony of an admiral and 100 witnesses." He punched the throttle, and the old ship roared to life, shaking off the dust of Onyx 3. "And we've got a queen who chose to be a person," Kaelen added. "That's a hell of a story, Rin." Rin smiled, and it was a look that would have stopped a war on its own. "It is a human story, Kaelen." The Star Suture shot into the stars, a small, battered vessel carrying the hope of 1,000,000,000 lives. They were heading for the heart of the machine, but they weren't afraid. They were a family, and they had already made their choice. The Vega Station was a masterpiece of architectural arrogance. A ring of silver and glass 5 kilometers in diameter, it hung in the stable gravity well of the Vega sun, like a crown offered to the gods of commerce and war. This was the seat of the high summit, the place where the Unification Treaty was to be signed, a document that would have legalized the Shadow Council's tyranny under the guise of interspecies peace. The space around the station was thick with dreadnoughts. Thousands of ships, their hulls gleaming with the cold light of a dozen different suns, formed a wall of steel that no unauthorized vessel could hope to pierce. Inside the Grand Hall, the air was pressurized to a perfect 22 degrees Celsius. The floor was a single slab of polished obsidian, reflecting the thousands of delegates who sat in tiered rows of velvet and gold. At the center of the hall, on a raised dais of white marble, sat the remaining members of the Shadow Council. General Kael stood at the podium, his voice amplified by 1,000 speakers until it boomed like thunder. "Today, we close the book on the era of chaos. We have neutralized the threat of the Siphon Queen. We have secured the frontiers. The Unification Treaty is not just a law, it is the dawn of a new humanity." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. They wanted to believe. They wanted to forget the blood and the fear. They were ready to sign away their freedom for the promise of a quiet night. Suddenly, the massive holographic display above the dais flickered. The image of the Union flag was replaced by a grainy, high-contrast video. It was the Iron Reach. The delegates gasped as they saw the rows of stasis pods. They heard the screaming of the refugees. They watched as Admiral Harkin, their hero of the Orestes siege, spoke of a cull, of a plague, of the impurities that had to be removed. "That is a forgery," Kael roared, his face turning a deep, angry red. "Security! Cut the feed!" But the feed didn't cut. The amber nanites had already infiltrated the station's communication grid, weaving themselves into the very fabric of the holographic projectors. The doors at the back of the hall hissed open. A man walked in. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He was 42 years old, wearing a faded, grease-stained flight suit and a pair of worn magnetic boots. He walked with a slight limp, his hands tucked into his pockets. It was Kaelen Vane, and beside him walked a woman in a gown of shimmering silver light. Her hair was like ink, her eyes a deep, soulful violet. She didn't look like a monster. She didn't look like a queen. She looked like someone who had just walked through fire and found something beautiful on the other side. The delegates fell silent. The thousands of soldiers in the hall raised their pulse rifles, but they didn't fire. They were looking at the woman's eyes. They were looking at the man's scarred, steady hands. "General Kael," Kaelen said, his voice quiet but carrying to the furthest rows of the hall. His voice didn't need amplification. The station's own resonance seemed to lift his words and carry them. "My name is Kaelen Vane. I was a chief medic in the Solari Infantry, and I'm here to tell you that the mission is over." "You are a traitor," Kael screamed, his hand hovering over his sidearm. "You are a terrorist who aided the enemy." "I didn't aid an enemy," Kaelen said, stopping at the base of the dais. He looked up at the council, his expression one of tired, patient clarity. "I treated a patient, and in doing so, I found a friend. And that friend, she taught me that the only thing more powerful than the machines you build is the choice to say no." He turned to the delegates, his gaze sweeping over the thousands of faces. You want peace? We all do. But you won't find it in a treaty that requires you to ignore the screaming of your neighbors. You won't find it in a plague that kills the weak to save the strong. Peace isn't something you sign. It's something you choose. Every day, every heartbeat. He looked at Rin. She stepped forward, her hand finding his. I am Nyx Raval, she said, her voice a harmonic melody that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the station. I am the one you called the Siphon Queen. For 300 years I lived by the logic of the predator. I thought my power was my birthright. I thought your lives were my fuel. She looked at the soldiers, her eyes full of a devastating kindness. But this man, this human medic, he showed me a different kind of power. He showed me the power of mercy. He gave me his own life force, not because I was his queen, but because I was a person in pain. He chose me. She raised her hand and a cloud of amber nanites erupted from her palm, swirling into the air like 1,000 tiny suns. These are the new wardens, she said. They do not kill. They do not cull. They heal. They are the record of our choice. The nanites spread through the hall, touching the delegates, the soldiers, and even the council members. They didn't cause pain. They caused a sudden, overwhelming clarity. The layers of propaganda, the fog of fear, and the cold logic of apathy began to dissolve. The unification treaty, lying on the marble table, began to glow. The paper turned to dust, the ink evaporating into the air. The soldiers lowered their weapons. One by one, they unlatched their helmets. General Kael reached for his gun, but his arm wouldn't move. The nanites had recognized the intent to harm and had gently, firmly neutralized the electrical impulses in his muscles. He sat back in his chair, defeated by a force he couldn't even comprehend. The summit was over, but the work was just beginning. 6 months later, the Star Suture was docked at a new station, a place called the Anchor. It wasn't a military outpost or a corporate hub. It was a multi-species medical center, built in the neutral space between the Solari Union and the Ethelgardian territories. Kaelen stood on the observation deck, watching the sunrise over a nearby gas giant. The orange and purple clouds were a swirling masterpiece of cosmic art. He held a mug of coffee in his hands, real coffee, brought in by a Tellarite merchant who had a debt of gratitude to settle. He heard footsteps behind him. He didn't have to turn to know who it was. The air around him grew warm, and the faint scent of rain and starlight filled his nose. The clinic is full, Rin said, leaning against the railing beside him. We have a line of patients reaching all the way to the docking bay. 3 humans with lung rot, a Tellarite with a broken gill, and a high-born Ethelgardian who wants to know if you can fix his vanity. Kaelen chuckled, taking a sip of his coffee. Nuance, Rin. Tell the high-born he has to wait his turn. The lung rot takes priority. Rin looked at him, her violet eyes soft. You are tired, Kaelen. Your hands, they are shaking again. It's a good shake, Kaelen said, looking at his scarred fingers. It reminds me that I'm still here. It reminds me of the choice. He set his mug down and turned to her. He took her hands in his. The shimmering silver of her skin was warm now, reflecting the light of the rising sun. They stood there for a long time, just breathing the same air, 2 souls who had found each other in the dark and decided to build a fire. I look back at that man on Void 9, the one who sat in the dark with a bottle of industrial whiskey, waiting for the gravity to fail. And I barely recognize him. He was a ghost, haunted by the thousands of faces he couldn't save. He thought he was done with the world, that he had earned his right to disappear into the rust and the silence. But then a dagger fell from the sky, and a monster asked for a bandage. I spent 12 years in the infantry learning how to classify life. I learned who was an ally and who was a target. I learned that some lives were worth more than others because of the uniform they wore or the flag they stood under. I thought that was wisdom. I thought that was how you survived the void. I was wrong. Humanity isn't a species. It isn't a DNA sequence or a place of birth. Humanity is the moment you stop calculating and start caring. It is the choice to reach across the gap, across the species, the history and the fear, and say, I see you, and you are not alone. I am still a man with a scalpel. My back still aches, and I still drink too much caffeine. But I'm not a ghost anymore. I'm a medic. And I've learned that the most important wound I'll ever treat isn't a hole in a lung or a tear in an artery. It's the hole in the soul that happens when we forget that we are all, every one of us, a family of choice. The void is huge, and it is cold, and it is full of things that want to turn us into numbers. But as long as one person chooses to stay, as long as one person refuses to let the light go out, the monsters lose. I'm glad I stayed. I'm glad I chose to be an idiot with a sense of mercy, because the view from here, it's a lot better than the one from the bottom of a whiskey bottle. I've spent a lot of my life running away from the things I couldn't fix, thinking my mistakes were the only thing that defined me. But standing here with Rin, I realized that the most important thing I ever did wasn't winning a war, but deciding to keep a single, impossible promise. I wonder if you look at the people in your life right now, the ones who stayed when they didn't have to, the ones who chose you when you were at your worst, do you see the family you were given or the family you made? And what is the one choice you could make today that might turn a monster into a friend or a ghost into a person? Kaelen took a final sip of his coffee and looked back at the busy hallway of the clinic, where the light of the new sun was just beginning to touch the faces of his patients. "Copy that," he whispered to the universe. "We're ready for the next one." He reached out and squeezed Rin's hand, and together they walked back into the beautiful, messy work of saving the world.